Hey everybody, this is Jamie Bateman with Labrador Lending, and today I want to shoot a quick video about land contracts or contracts for deed, CFDs. You'll hear this term thrown around. You may be familiar with it as a note investor. If you're a newer note investor, you may have heard the term, but you're not totally sure how CFD compares to a traditional note and mortgage or note and deed of trust, depending on the state. We're going to hit on some of the key similarities and differences. Obviously, we're not going to get into every little nuanced detail here, but feel free to reach out if you have questions. So I'm going to base this talk on a blog post I wrote almost 2 years ago now, entitled Investing in Land Contracts. It's posted on my website, labradorlending.com, and it was dated August 4th, 2019. So just for defining terminology, when I'm talking about CFDs in this video, if I say buyer, I also mean the borrower. They're the same thing. If I say seller or investor or lender, those three are the same thing. If I say land contract or contract, that's the same thing as a contract for deed or a CFD. And a rent to own is a lease option, at least for the purposes of this video. So what is a land contract or a contract for deed, aka CFD? It is a form of seller financing used primarily on lower valued properties, often in rural areas. Often the buyer of the property is someone who, given their personal situation and circumstances, is unable to obtain traditional bank financing or even a seller financing where the deed transfers immediately. So they may be in a situation where they don't have the greatest credit history, they don't have much to put down as far as a down payment, and this is their path to home ownership. So the difference between the one major difference between a land contract or CFD and seller financing where the deed does transfer ownership immediately is that with a CFD or land contract, the lender is actually the holder of that deed for the period of time where the land contract is still in play. So until the buyer has satisfied the terms of the loan, the deed does not transfer to their name. So in other words, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they've got to make all those payments, pay down that debt and pay it off and satisfy the terms of the loan and that is when the deed will transfer into their name. So that's probably the biggest initial upfront difference between a traditional note / mortgage and a CFD. So when does the buyer become the owner of the property? Not until the loan is paid off. So during that period of time while there is the loan, which may be many, many years, the buyer is considered to have equitable title. They do not have legal title. So the seller or the CFD holder / investor actually has legal title during that period of time. So what happens if the buyer fails to make payments? Well, this is one of the key differences, and this varies by state big time. A lot of the gurus out there will promote CFDs as far as investing in them or buying them because you can often do a forfeiture rather than a foreclosure. So a forfeiture is typically much faster and less expensive as far as taking back. If you're the lender, the buyer stops making payments, it's oftentimes faster and less expensive to take the property back so that you essentially cancel the land contract, and then there's no more loan and you have full title to the property. So one of the things that's touted is that it's less expensive and faster to take the property back, and also that you may end up getting whatever equity is in that property. Investor beware, these properties there's typically not a whole lot of equity. It depends what we're talking about, but these are not high-end properties. So I have found in our experience that there's not typically a whole lot of equity to be working with, but there may be. And some people love CFDs, don't get me wrong. We've purchased a good number of CFDs. We actually have converted a lot of them over to traditional notes and mortgages. So, you can feel free to reach out and ask me more about that. How's a land contract different than a rent-to-own agreement? Essentially, well, some people will argue that a rent-to-own or lease option is a form of seller financing. Other people will argue that it's not. Really doesn't matter. A rent-to-own arrangement, instead of during that period of time where, so in a rent-to-own arrangement, it's actually a tenant for a period of time that you have in the property at a predetermined price, and then at the end of the contract period is when that tenant becomes the buyer. So with a land contract, the buyer agrees to purchase the property at the outset, sometimes with a balloon payment, and a rent-to-own carries less of an obligation for the buyer at the end of the contract than a land contract does. So a rent-to-own arrangement gives the buyer the option, not the obligation, to buy the property at the end of the contract period. However, with a land contract, the buyer has already entered into a loan agreement for the full purchase price. So that's really the primary difference between those two. Let's see. So another major difference between a rent-to-own arrangement and a land contract is that with a rent-to-own, the seller maintains control and responsibility for the property. The seller investor is responsible for maintenance of the property, any repairs, and payment of property taxes and insurance. The seller is essentially a landlord during the period of the contract. Now, with a CFD, as an investor / seller, you are responsible for those property taxes, and you should have liability insurance if you have forced place insurance on the property. So, think of you've got your note and mortgage here, and you've got your CFD here, and then you've got your lease option here. And I don't mean that in any one is better than the other, but a land contract is kind of in between a note and mortgage and a lease option. What are the benefits of a land contract for the borrower? Well, they may have poor credit history, inconsistent income, and they may not have a lot of options to get traditional financing. And so the threshold is lower for this buyer. And so a land contract is also viewed by the buyer as a way to lower the purchase price before obtaining a regular mortgage to buy the property outright. So that's possible as well. You could have a land contract for 5 to 10 years, then work something out after that. What are the benefits of a land contract for the investor? Forfeiture is often touted as faster. Forfeitures are generally faster and less expensive than foreclosures. Just make sure that in the state that your CFD is in, that the property is in, that a CFD that you can actually do a forfeiture. Because there are many states, Maryland, for example, Missouri, I believe, you cannot do a forfeiture. So even though you have a CFD and you're thinking this buyer stop payment, well, I can do a forfeiture real fast and get the property back and get all that equity. Well, a lot of times you may be stuck with a foreclosure anyway. So just be careful about that as an investor, because you may have all the liability that comes with property ownership and a land contract, and not much of the upside that you may have with a CFD in another state. So some states, CFDs are not all that beneficial to own, in my opinion. So what are some of the risks with land contracts? As far as the investor goes, you have a greater chance of lawsuits, fines, etc. Any kind of nuisance issues are going to come your way. Your company or you as an individual, you're on title. So you're responsible for property taxes, anything going on with that property as far as the government or state authorities are concerned, or county and city authorities. Obviously, in your contract, you're going to have it written different ways as far as your relationship with the buyer. So they may be responsible to actually make those payments, but as far as the property taxes, for example, or county records, it's you. You're on title. You have legal title until that land contract is paid off. Also, in a lot of states, it does seem like CFDs have fallen out of favor. They are a little bit, they can be a little bit controversial. And so there have been some lawsuits. You can Google that. And that's another reason that we've tried to convert many of our CFDs over to notes and mortgages. One other reason we've done that is that this adds value to the asset itself. Notes generally trade at a slightly higher price point than CFDs do. So if you have a strong CFD where the borrower's been paying and maybe there's not a whole lot of equity in the property, my recommendation would be try to see if the borrower will convert that over to a note and mortgage. This gives them the full legal title immediately, transfers the property over to the borrower immediately, and provides a little less liability and less work, frankly, on your side as the investor, as far as the investor goes. So there's definitely a lot more to CFDs than what we've talked about here. Feel free to reach out with any questions. There are pros and cons to everything in the note space, and CFDs are no different. I hope you've enjoyed this video. My email address is batemanjames@labradorlending.com, and we have lots of free, valuable information on our website, labradorlending.com. Take care.